At the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, there's a painting called The Last Spike by Thomas Hill. And that painting has a ghost, and he's staring out at us instead of at the ceremony taking place over his shoulder. His name is Theodore Judah, and he's the reason that the ceremony even happened, even though he had been dead for almost 6 years by that point. And that point in time was the Golden Spike ceremony on May 10th, 1869, which also triggered the accidental birth of the Newsflash. And the Newsflash is the reason I'm telling you this story in the first place. So, we're not done with Ted, but the ceremony was simply called the marriage by the two companies involved. Officials from the Union Pacific Railroad, building their line west from Omaha, were to meet the heads of the Central Pacific Railroad, who had been building east from Sacramento, joining at Promontory Summit in the Utah wilderness. Nationwide, the telegraph lines stayed clear to carry the instant that the last spike was driven and the two lines connected, completing the Great Transcontinental Railroad. Keeping the whole telegraph network open created a giant circuit of attention that covered the whole nation. Bells and alarms from every connected telegraph office and firehouse were programmed to ring out together. Never before had such a large percentage of the nation's population listened with the same ear to the same moment. And the Eastern Telegraph cable was wrapped around a golden spike, and the Western line was wrapped around a hammer. A copper plate was connected to register the impulse instant the last spike was driven. Pulling California into the nation's orbit by rail was as big a deal as the Apollo 11 moonshot 100 years later. Maybe bigger, because it affected everyone. The entire country could move about in ways impossible before. We would all become astronauts. The vice president of the Union Pacific, Thomas C. Durant, arrived 2 days late for the ceremony, pulled by engine 119.
Roger.
Leland Stanford, now head of the Central Pacific Railroad, had been on site all morning, and hundreds milled about, and reporters from all over the country descended on the site to witness history. Live. At least for the length of the signal, but live for the nation in that instant. From New York to Seattle, Omaha to New Orleans, crowds waited and waited.
Thank you very much.
The oldest maps of the New World showed California as an island, but before the Transcontinental Railroad connected California with the rest of the nation, it was more like a distant moon, an inaccessible place beyond our endless prairie grass atmosphere and past the asteroid belt of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, space and time standing in our way. But in a single generation, the invention of moving by rail increased the speed of travel more than any time in the last 4,000 years, bridging an impossible distance while compressing travel time from months to days. Stanford and Durant each took their place to tap down the final spike.
To the country.
Legend has them both fumbling and missing, but there's no contemporary evidence that shows it was anything but surgical quick. That telegraphed instant triggered guns at Fort Point in San Francisco to fire into the Pacific, while cannons rattled the windows of lower Manhattan. In Chicago, tens of thousands of people poured out into the streets, forming an impromptu parade that snaked lazily for 7 miles. On site, they pulled the 2 engines, the Jupiter and the 119, close enough to almost kiss, and everyone present posed for photographs and drank. Theodore Judah wasn't even mentioned by any of the pontificating leaders who spoke that day. He was painted in by the artist when Stanford commissioned the painting to commemorate the moment years later. But Theodore's contribution was impossible to ignore completely. But the only person claiming to have witnessed Ted's ghost during the ceremony was his widow, Anna Judah. And Anna was thousands of miles away at the moment the last spike was driven. She did not travel to Utah, staying at her family home in Massachusetts. Her husband wasn't even 40 when he uncovered the best route to thread a railroad through the Lockjaw mountain range of the Sierra Nevadas. He died while running the project. He got sick traveling to New York, planning to meet with investors and buy out Stanford and his Sacramento partners. But it never came to be. After Theodore's death, Stanford and his group took over, and they never looked back. And the Golden Spike ceremony was supposed to have been held on May 8th, but Thomas Durant's late arrival pushed it to May 10th. And May 10th was the same day as Anna and Ted's wedding anniversary, 22 years earlier, in 1847. So Anna refused all visitors that day, wanting to be alone. But when the news flashed done across the telegraph network and the fire alarms and church bells in her town rang out as they did across the nation, she knew at the same moment as everyone else. And Anna said the spirit of her brave husband settled upon her right then, and together they bore witness in silence. But what she called his spirit, I attribute to Anna experiencing the spooky action at a distance that is the modern newsflash, that phantom limb feeling, common to us all now, but new to her, the feeling of sharing an event's moment, but not the event's location. It's a speed of light power that increases in proportion to the available audience tuning in. So when enough attention is focused in one direction, then a shared myth is formed. During the Apollo 11 mission, the entire nation watched, transfixed, witnessing the first human to walk upon the surface of the moon, live. It was estimated that 94% of televisions in the United States were turned on and into the coverage across 3 networks. Never before had so many experienced the same moment. And on a cold and rainy November morning, 4 months after that historic first moon landing, we're going back with 3 new astronauts, Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. The second mission to land humans upon the surface of our planet's only moon. But a simple human error on the surface of the moon by one of those astronauts exposed how fragile the power of our newsflash truly is. Unfortunately, though, that wasn't the first problem the mission faced. Their first problem happened just after launch.
Pete Conrad reports that your program is in.
Altitude at 1/2 mile.
Altitude at 1/2 mile.
Roll complete. Roger, Pete.
But 40 seconds in, a white flash fills the cabin and static pops the headsets. All the warning lights across the control panel come alive at once, more than anyone had ever seen or discussed, and nothing prepared the crew for this, so they did what they were trained to do. Nothing.
I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload 1 and 2, main bus A and B out.
A few seconds later, the rocket ship, traveling over 1,500 feet per second, gets hit with another bolt of light. Now the lights on the instrument panel go dark.
Okay, we just lost the platform, gang. I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. Roger.
The astronauts still felt pinned against the G-force rush from all that thrust, from all that fuel, burning 13 metric tons per second. Then the backup batteries kick in, and panel lights return, but you can't go to the moon on a backup battery. The engineers had about a minute to figure it out. They had until the capsule left orbit. Until that happened, the crew could still bail and hope to land in the ocean. Pete was ready to abort the mission. Procedure had taught him that in the event of a power failure, the astronauts could abort the mission themselves. And according to procedure, he probably should have already hit the button, but he waited. John Aaron says, try SCE to aux. John had seen this before. He was a 24-year-old ECOM in charge of the electrical systems, and a year previous, he saw a similar pattern of gibberish data flash across his screen during a launch simulation. After the simulation, he had gone back and looked at the data readouts, tracing the weird hiccup to an accidental voltage drop that the capsule had suffered, causing the SCE to temporarily fail. SCE means Signal Conditioning Equipment. It converts all the raw signals so they can be displayed uniformly across all instruments. So when the SCE fails, everyone is data blind.
40 seconds. Mark 1 Bravo.
John Aaron tells his supervisor, try SCE to aux. If the SCE was forced into auxiliary mode, then it would function at the lower voltage from the battery backups, and then the crew could reboot and continue on.
Apollo 12 Houston, try SCE to auxiliary, over.
NCE to auxiliary.
SCE to auxiliary.
Neither the flight director or Pete knew what that meant. There were 100 levers and switches and buttons, and they did not know which one referred to SCE. But Alan Bean knew. SCE to aux was a switch at his fingertips. So he flipped it. Alan had saved the mission, live on TV.
And whatever the problem was, from lightning hitting the spacecraft, as Conrad seems to have thought it was, but there's no confirmation, the crew has successfully recovered and regained full electrical power. Their AC buses and the fuel cells are working. And the mission is continuing.
Apollo 12 was the first mission to have a live color television feed. Pete had pulled the camera down from the lunar module once he was safely on the surface, and for the first hour or so, it worked flawlessly. Then Alan moved the camera.
Okay, Houston, I'm going to move the TV camera now. Roger, Al.
Positioning it in a way that accidentally pointed the lens at the naked eye of the sun, blinding the image processor and abruptly ending live images for the rest of Apollo 12's mission on the moon's surface.
There's the TV. And there's that.
The cameras were seen by the engineers and the astronauts as the least important part of the mission. Every ounce of the lunar module was precious, and a bulky color TV camera was a pain in the ass, and they treated it that way.
I think that'll be okay, though. That'll give you a good shot right in here. Let's see if I can keep the sun from getting in the camera at all. Al, we have a pretty bright image on that TV. Could you either move it or stop it down? Okay, I'm going to have to stop it down.
But the live feed took us along on the mission, and sharing the feed with everyone wasn't some bonus feature, but one of the most important parts of the mission. Once the feed went blind, though, everyone watching tuned out, turned off their TVs. We broke the circuit of attention. The audience for the Apollo missions cratered right then and there as the impact of the missing images sunk in. The networks had been afraid to turn away, afraid to upset such a huge audience, but once they saw the audience had fled, then they started to cut away more and more, diluting real-time coverage of the Apollo missions with regular programming, the type of programming the networks could sell ads against. Apollo 11 had cost the networks millions of dollars, and they could not afford to be the nation's open channel. And the massive audience who saw it in real time are the ones who have seared the event into our collective myth. No Apollo mission was covered in the same way again, and no live event was ever witnessed by such a large portion of an available audience. It's not that the audience for an event would never again be so large. There are global sporting events that get a larger audience now, but there are way more screens on the planet than there were in 1969. As more and more screens fill every corner of our lives, the ability for all those screens to tune into the same moment and form that same circuit of attention is actually shrinking. Other than a phone call or a text, most phones can't receive a live signal that's not filtered through an app or a social network. When live events are filtered and reported differently to fragmented audiences, then the stories they tell become fragmented, and it gets harder for all of us to share the same stories.
Hey guys, I'm about to walk the red carpet.
1969 turned out to be a moment when our circuit of attention was strongest, when one event could reach everyone. In 1969, everyone's TV showed the same thing. I mean, if 94% of televisions were turned on and into Apollo 11 coverage, can you imagine 94% of every smartphone and tablet in the United States tuning into the same event in real time, without a social network acting as a gatekeeper? We are losing the ability to receive a message that can interrupt anyone at the speed of light and is free for everyone to receive, anonymously. Sharing a common moment, but not the location, creates this circuit of attention. It doesn't matter what channel we're using, telegraph, radio, television, or digital. It is our collective actions that create this connection. Don't break the circuit.
Here is a bulletin from Channel 5 News.